You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hi, everybody. My name's Andreas, and I'm really honored and excited to have Marina Vishmidt here with us. Marina, by way of an intro, is a writer and an editor. She teaches at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her work has appeared in South Atlantic Quarterly, Ephemera, Afterall, the Journal of Cultural Economy, Australian Feminist Studies, and Radical Philosophy, among many, many others, and as well as a number of edited volumes. She is the co-author of Reproducing Autonomy with Kerstin Stakemeier on Mute in 2016, and a book that we'll be talking about today, Speculation as a Mode of Production, Forms of Value Subjectivity and Art in Capital on Brill in 2018 and Haymarket 2019. She is one of the organizers of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths, a member of the Marxism and Culture Collective, and is on the board of the New Perspectives on the Critical Theory of Society series, Bloomsbury Academic. So Marina, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Yeah, it's nice to have this format, even through screen and headphones, to continue some of the conversations we've been having the last few months, to do with your book, to do with the conditions that have come to the fore with the COVID pandemic, not least of which is the incredible uprisings in the United States and elsewhere that are, I'm sure I can say that we're both in solidarity with what's happening at the moment. And I imagine that based on what we've said we would talk about, it's going to come up a lot in the conversation, so I won't do much by way of intro. And I guess maybe the best place to start is actually with your book, Speculation as a Mode of Production, if you don't mind.
Yep.
So in the book, you draw this very interesting parallel between the processes of speculation in financialized capitalism and in art, arguing that neither financialized capitalism nor artistic production can be thought of as unproductive labor. And as a way to get started, I hope you don't mind if I quote you at some length. You write that the concern here is to draw a parallel between contemporary capital and contemporary art as they come to constitute the poles of a society structured around speculation, reflected in social practices ranging from systems of welfare, provision, to the constitution of the self and the image of work. And then later on, you say that a major stake of this book is how art can apply speculative negation, which denaturalizes both its own status and that of non-art practices. So I guess just to start and give a bit of a frame, we should say that you're specific about what you mean by art, where you write that art is not so much, or at least the art that you're interested in the book, is not so much in its character as an exceptional commodity, but at a more integral analytic level, as an activity that harbors emancipatory agency, which can be commodified insofar as, or because it seems to counter the universality of alienation generated by the tightening grip of the value form over social relations. So thanks for bearing with me reading your own work back to you. But I guess to start, could you just explain briefly how you understand these two different speculations, or forms of speculation?
Yeah, sure. Insofar as I do understand them. So to begin with, I guess one simple heuristic that I've used in discussion around this kind of double or maybe rather non-identical concept of speculation, and non-identity has a methodological dimension that I'll get into with regard to your second question, which you haven't mentioned yet, is that I came across in Stephen Shaviro's work, which is his writing on open and closed speculation, as two different kind of types or trajectories or vectors of the speculative for him. So to posit an open, on the one hand, and a closed strain of speculation as a social logic or a social form means already to engage in imminent critique of the image of speculation that we normally have to hand, which is generally either a vaguely emancipatory one, as in like speculative fiction, so one that's quite proximate to a utopian type of thinking or approach, or the kind of more disparaging one of irresponsible financial speculation, which is kind of more considered to be something like, I don't know, problem gambling reproduced and reinforced at the scale of the capitalist system, right? So this kind of casino understanding of the nature of capitalism today. So what would what that could mean, using these open and closed forms to think about speculation, what that could mean is seeing how financial speculation, which thinks of itself as wealth creating or market making as kind of generative in a specific way, doesn't actually create anything but more of itself. So that can be seen as a prime example of closed speculation, that it has no horizon besides an indefinite replication of the future as the present, or a present of returns predicated on enclosing the future. Meanwhile, the kind of open speculation that tends to sort of belong to the spaces of theory, of art, that which is supposedly able to renew perception, propose new worlds or ways of being, is open as well in the indefinite way that its emancipatory promise is institutionally and economically not only imbricated in the closed speculation of the financial market, which might be a true but somewhat kind of hackneyed observation, but also in the disciplinary autonomy of those fields that defines their way of doing speculation as constitutively free, so to speak, of real-world consequences. So that's kind of the default understanding of why they're open. So that's maybe also a kind of Brechtian point in a way, that aesthetic speculation has to be materialized as this, I guess, socially or politically speculative. That is, what is it in aesthetic form and aesthetic performance that can displace both its confinement as aesthetic form and give it an imminent connection to actual and unpredictable, hence open, hence actually speculative, processes of determinate social transformation undertaken by situated movements in time and space. So the idea of speculation then seems to shade into a sort of genealogical or equally imminent critique of the autonomy ideology as the infrastructure of art's concept of itself as critical, but also the greatest source of sand in the ability of this infrastructure to carry out its intended tasks. So that's either a kind of so you can think of it as a kind of scripted non-performance, kind of this conventional understanding of autonomy, or perhaps a need for the defunctionalization of this particular type of scripted non-performance, perhaps.
That's really,
No,
really
it's okay.
helpful.
Sorry,
I interrupted.
I think, well, because you were kind enough to send me advance notice of your questions. I'm looking at your second question now.
Right, at least some of them. Well, yeah. So the second point, I guess, was just following from these two different conceptions of opened and closed speculative models. I kind of wanted to ask you to explain the theoretical methodology, which you kind of already got to, that you take in the book, which is quite wide in a very good sense, and which draws on an analysis of work, including of course artworking, and that work's subsumption to capital, Adornian aesthetics, which you got at without mentioning his name so far, value theory, and many other strains of thought. So if you could just walk us through the methodology that this takes, juggling all these different things.
I mean, it is, as you say, it's quite diverse, and maybe it's a bit of a messy amalgam. And
I don't think so.
So I mean, I have felt that maybe more of a reflection, more of an articulated or explicit reflection, or even a programmatic outline of the book's methodology is maybe one aspect that I would have liked to maybe have developed further in the text, and it's one that I've been trying to focus on when I've been presenting the book in public talks in recent months. I've really been trying to think about methodology in those presentations. So I suppose because the book is at its core, and maybe even overall a PhD thesis with a certain level of revision, but not at all like a complete overhaul, the mix of methodologies also reflects the process of putting it together over a long period of time. Maybe not so much on the angle of time, but the reflection of the process. Maybe you can think about Robert Morris's box with the sound of its own making there.
I think that's might be my favorite artwork, in fact.
it's pretty, I feel pretty close to it as well. So I guess I do say something in the beginning of the book about it being a speculative methodology. So meaning speculation operating in this unstable double way as both a principle of construction and a principle of analysis. So what does that mean? That means, at least from my standpoint right now, that means that there's a level of recursion operative in parts of the text. So there's this kind of ultra-dialectical structure. That means that none of the propositions that I make in the book get to stand very long before being subjected to kind of further revision and critique. So it's a slightly self-undermining mode of writing, or mode of exposition, or form, rather, of exposition. So that's maybe where this idea of non-identity can also be seen as operative in the writing. And that attaches directly as well to the idea of productivity and non-productivity that you mentioned in the beginning. So that all these ideas have to be situated, especially when they seem to function as axiomatic in Marxist analysis, as well as other forms of knowledge production about art, economy, labor, and so forth. So I'm thinking about the object in Adorno's understanding of non-identity at its very most minimal, his most minimal understanding of it is that the object can never be subsumed by the concept. And part of that resistance to subsumption rebounds on the coherence of the very concept, which also has to become, in a way, an object, or fragment into multiple objects for itself, as it were. And the first object that it's encountering in this concept-object relationship likewise has to be taken as partial and unstable. So this kind of mutual refraction and transformation of the concept and the object. So there's probably, at the methodological level, a lot going on in the book that's not exactly, as I already mentioned, articulated, about epistemological questions to do with critique and the politics of critique. So questions that are equally concerned with how to do critique and how to do a critique of ways of doing critique, to put it broadly, and how both of these can contribute to a reification and ways of kind of forestalling that by trying to practice something more like a negative dialectical approach. Though some would argue we have to hold on to Hegel's negativity per se and not try to elaborate another more negative negativity. I guess critics of Adorno's response to Hegel with negative dialectics. So anyway, kind of to try and develop this more kind of homemade negative dialectical approach that practices its politics in the field of theory by always remaining mutable vis-a-vis its objects of study and how those objects reflect on themselves. And this also has to do methodologically with engaging in the different levels of abstraction that a so-called dialectical method should be holding open, but also holds as imperative to both engage with and trace the mediations between these different levels as well. Sorry, that became very tangled, but I think tangling is another aspect of the methodology.
Well, tangling and then untangling. If we hold that metaphor with Morris's box with the sound of its own making, there's that famous story of, or probably a myth, or certainly a myth, of Cage coming to his place to see the box and listening to the whole piece for 3 hours. So there's definitely a process of untangling here. I think actually one of the strongest parts of the book is this weaving together of different methodologies that happen as you critique the very critiques that you're sort of identifying. And it's not that something is dropped or left behind. It comes back in another way. For example, when we get to the part of the book that talks about different productive models and forms, the fact that you sort of don't get stuck in an ontological critique of human capital or something like that, it's a big strength because you're able to actually focus on capital and historical modes of production and things like this.
That's
but yeah,
good
before
to hear.
it's why we're here, right? I guess I would ask, before we get to yet more nitty gritty, how sort of speculation can be codified as creativity. And you sort of tackle this even in the introduction already by distinguishing creative capitalism on the one hand and the turn to performance and conceptualism in art on the other. So could you maybe elaborate that distinction, or let's say non-distinction?
No, I'll have a go. I guess there, with speculation codified as creativity and those kind of two moments that you mentioned, there I'd be thinking about how creativity is sort of generally reallocated from labor to capital in the kind of common sense of neoliberalism. And so capitalizing on the so-called immaterial becomes a modus operandi right across different forms of social production, both as a symbolic universe and an ethical predisposition that spans the cultural and the so-called real economy. So the creation of value as this kind of individualizing, propertizing, and branding of cultural and social material is, in a way, goes back further, in some ways goes back further in modernity. It's this kind of aesthetic attitude that Hegel already forecasts as the groundless ground of modernity, the aesthetic subject of modernity. And in Agamben's book on aesthetic subjectivity, The Man Without Content, that I have some discussion of in the book. Or in the words of Baudelaire, quote, of the vaporization and centralization of the self. Everything is here, end quote. Yet there's still a distinction, I guess I would say, even if you kind of make this genealogy go back further, this kind of aesthetic subject, there's still a distinction between the artist as a maker of, I guess, specific objects, ultimately maybe around the time of the turn in Donald Judd's sense, and the artist as an entrepreneur of themselves, i.e. in the kind of Joseph Schumpeter sense of the entrepreneur as a maker of new combinations. So or combining things that already exist in new ways. So the creativity of the artist and a sort of generalized creative economy notion of creativity that underpins gentrification and so many other dimensions of structural violence, especially in urban areas, is symptomatic of a lot of things. Ideologically, perhaps, it's symptomatic of the necessity of precarizing more and more of the population, or the fact that capital's valorization now is more invested in the control of laboring populations and those who are excluded from laboring, or in rooting around them, than it is in putting them to work directly. I guess when it comes to culture and art and attempting to dissociate it from those imperatives and put it in a more practical connection to social and political movements for liberation and refusal, as with speculation, creativity has to be wrested back from capital and redefined in terms that build out the generative and propositional aspects of those fights, which are so often couched in terms of regression and defensiveness by their enemies, and in terms of vulnerability and melancholy by those who might see themselves as allies. So there really needs to be a kind of full weight given to the speculative and creative dimensions of antagonism, if that doesn't sound too abstract. I mean, I realize it might. It's just incredibly obvious that there can only be stagnation and conservatism if we look to culture to lead the way, rather than seeing culture as both utterly suffusing and instigated by social movements, like the insurrection on the streets now. So how much cultural change is happening, how much aesthetic innovation that's triggered by that event of speculative politics and world-ending praxis. I mean, thinking of cultural change both on the kind of institutional, and then possibly that can be also seen as performative industrial in many cases, but also in the sense of people's practices and people's alliances who are, otherwise kind of atomized creative professionals.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a great line in the beginning of your book that sort of acts as a nice addendum to this, which is that the artist, you say, like the financial instrument, can gather all kinds of data and material and reproduce them as art. Just as in a sense that derivatives gather all kinds of empirical phenomena and reproduce them as profit. So this dual nature of speculation is incredibly interesting, especially if we connect it like the way you did at the end to sort of actual social change happening, not through culture, but let's say cultural change itself, if I can put it like that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, one way that you do this, or let's say the main way that you do this, is to think speculation, both of these speculations, as productive, which means coming to terms with its relationship to labor, both as a historical class and as sort of this constantly reconstituting class of workers or unemployed people, social reproduction workers, and so on. So can you elaborate on how you, let's say, make the case that speculation, both financially and in this negative Adornian sense in art, is sort of connected to a productive form?
I mean, I think this might end up kind of sounding like a roundabout way to approaching it, but let's see. So what you're saying, I think it's connected to where I suggest in the book, I think quite early on, that we need to think speculation negatively. That is, in terms that seem to, and so I guess we need to maybe connect that negativity to the productive means. So negatively in terms that seem to be furthest, again, ideologically or axiomatically in the Western political and philosophical tradition, from the kind of normative creativity and openness and in a way abstraction of the speculative. So, and the main way that I think it negatively is exactly in terms of labor. So I would see it really as a kind of counter Hannah Arendt move. For her, politics is creative, and it's the kind of paradigm of creativity, whereas labor is biological, repetitive, not fully human, anything but creative. So I think if you are taking a more kind of critical, dialectical, materialist approach, you see how labor actually ensures the creativity of the speculative. As a social form, as a practice, in lots of ways. So I talk about the labor of the negative as a line of argument both within and departing from Hegel, and especially Adorno's approach to Hegel, which means engaging with the social form of what it means to do speculative philosophy. And here I'd also like to take the opportunity to recommend the brilliant essay I just read by Hama Malduri in the current issue of Radical Philosophy that embarks on just such a project, actually. And more prosaically, I'd say there's also that what I've been sort of trying to describe is also the dialectical approach to the question of labor politics in art, where I'd want us to look at that as not something to be affirmed or dismissed, but as a political articulation of the labor that was always there and constitutively excluded for art to reproduce itself solipsistically as autonomous, i.e., as dependent on financial surplus rather than on labor. So an organizational rather than thematic appropriation of the labor in art is possibly the only way that a negative critique of that autonomy can be initiated both using the institutional and infrastructural resources of the autonomy that financialized autonomy that persists, and to allow it to transversely connect with and through movements elsewhere, and to materialize those movements within the space of art as a concrete rather than gestural politics. So I guess I'm kind of trying to read labor as a kind of productive or determinate, maybe negation of speculation, but I'm also trying to read them in other parts of the book. I might be trying to do the reverse and read them against each other, so against kind of naturalizing or renaturalizing concepts of labor as well.
Yeah. I find especially the second part of that sentence, this reading labor against it, is incredibly generative, especially since you begin with Adorno's sort of conception of art as both absolute commodity on the one side and as a space of non-labor on the other. And I guess we've kind of addressed this just by talking about it, but I should mention that, if we go back to the mid to late 60s, we're both very interested in this moment when artists began, at least rhetorically, to identify with the historical worker struggle through monikers like art worker and things like this. You write in the book that only labor, later on in the book, that only labor can check the infinite expansion of the automatic subject of capitalist value in art as elsewhere. But I guess, do you have anything to say on that, or do you want to talk maybe about immaterial labor and dematerialization, which follows?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can say just a little bit about that. Although as you say, we've kind of already started discussing that in the sort of previous questions and sort of reflections on those questions in part. But yeah, insofar as the automatic subject, I'd say, of self-valorization is a presupposition in the imaginary, institutional, and libidinal economies of art as they are elsewhere in capitalist social production, as it is elsewhere in capitalist social production. And in art, it's premised on the kind of plenitude. This automatic subject is premised on the plenitude of the creative author figure, however dispersed or dissolved in intention or in project, if not in practice. then it's only kind of going back and kind of centering and articulating labor that you can block, negate, withdraw from that cycle of valorization or socialize it, to suspend it and introduce another relationship to time than the empty teleological time of desocialized creativity, the time of the market. So that means the politics of labor rather than a labor-related content, which is probably already obvious. And that is an issue for cultural workers as much as for artists in whatever, or art producers, curators, people who are professionalized as producers. It's an issue for all kinds of cultural workers in whatever situational sense we want to draw the boundaries between them. Because the political economy of the cultural field is very often one where you have to first invest in your own precarity in order to have a platform or a voice to disinvest from it elsewhere or at another time. And that's why unionization is so important, not for itself, but because it creates a block, both for individuals and organizations, to reproducing those particular automatic subject relations, which are class relations and property relations primarily. But yeah, I'd be happy to move on to the dematerialization and immateriality part of the conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the last comment you made on artist, or let's say cultural worker unions, feeds well into that next question. I will say that I completely agree, and I think that often this is lost, or let's say in some art writing, that sort of the making of a union is not an end in itself, that the making of a union allows you to create a form of popular power that then can actually connect you to the historical worker struggle, to struggles in the community, let's say. I mean, exactly. For example, if you've just organized a museum union, why not use that popular base not to agitate just for higher wages for sort of the people who can fit into that union structure, but also against the gentrification that museum is certainly causing in whatever neighborhood it finds itself in, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this for me is number one. But yeah, I mean, so the sort of historical legacies of dematerialization and also immaterial labor, the uses of those terms are something you and I are both interested in a lot, if you allow me to speak for you. So, I mean, and as dematerialization, we're talking about this ostensible dematerialization of the art object with the advent of conceptualism and performance. And immaterial labor, we're talking about this sort of term that's been widely criticized by anarchists, radical feminists of color in particular, that sort of serves to essentialize too broad a swath of post-Fordist labor. I think Federici once wrote that the term immaterial labor saps the term of any feminine reproductive work that it might have sort of had. But yeah, so to that point, you write eloquently elsewhere in the book about how sort of some of these post-operaist writing on immaterial labor, cognitive capital, the general intellect are grounded more, as I mentioned earlier, in ontological concerns, as you say, than in those of capital and historical production. So can you speak to these two terms from the perspectives of, as you call it, the topologies of speculation, the title of your second chapter?
I mean, this is maybe venturing something I don't really have a kind of very ready argument for, but I wonder if maybe part of what I'm doing there is maybe there's a kind of attempt to shift our attention away from discourses around immateriality and dematerialization and see if we can get, if maybe this analytic of speculation could be more generative, because it kind of shifts our attention to the social form rather than this kind of confusing oscillation between form and content that leaves kind of discourses of immateriality and dematerialization so exposed to so many different kinds of critiques because they're very imprecise categories. So I guess one of the kind of obvious kind of, I guess you could say, constitutive critiques to those notions is, well, in what sense has value ever been material? So the whole discourse around immateriality or immaterialization in kind of political economy and philosophy, I mean, it's kind of much easier to critique dematerialization as an art historical category, of course. The whole discourse of immateriality, or immaterial labor, as it's often material production, as it's been sort of inflected, that whole discourse, while it's important as an attempt to track kind of global and, I guess, more regional, global north perhaps, regional, epochal and productive shifts, I think it's a confusing and it's an incoherent discourse. It vacillates between the content of commodities, between modes of accumulation, types of valorization, and types of regulation and regimes of labor. It's just very, I think it's very confusing. So I think if we say like value has never been material, all labor is always material, that's maybe one kind of set of terms to bring into that discussion. So with this idea of topologies of speculation, there's maybe an attempt at seeing what the dimensions of a speculative field and what its relational coordinates might be, if we take the semantics of topology literally. And again, maybe the resistance to proposing a new sort of master category like speculation, and just maybe more of an interest in seeing what the field effects or resonances, repercussions of this category might be. And maybe it might even entail, like, provisionally, a move from a focus on space, so the material, the immaterial, to time, so the speculative, which is a temporal category. So move from the content of production to its relationship to temporality, the experience of being in time, working for time, getting time to work for you. And so this relationship to temporality being the principal vector for how we'd see the link between the economic and the social, the financial and the aesthetic. And in that sense, I do feel that more discussion of Moshe Pistoni's work on this point, as in his Time, Labor, and Social Domination, could have been helpful, or will be helpful for future work in this regard that I'm doing in my research, rather than just the engagement I have in the book with his non-dogmatic concept of abstract labor, which I found very useful.
I also find that term incredibly useful in thinking this question. I will say that sometimes it confuses me why dematerialization is seen as a process, let's say, or a series of processes. And again, like, we can problematize this, and in fact, it's sort of more a posture or a series of gestures. But immaterial labor is seen as this monolithic descriptor rather than a process itself. For me, immateriality is just a form of obfuscation. How else could you bridge, a white collar data worker, and an unpaid sanitation worker, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe a similar issue with discourses around precarity and precarization. So there's a kind of, in the attempt to make a kind of unifying category, there's a sort of projection of a coalition, of a possibility for coalition, which is maybe more obvious in the kind of discourse around precarity, where you do have incredibly vast sort of like divergences and kind of class and agency between different kinds of precarized workers, such as the data worker or the agency worker in sanitation, you could say. Whereas immateriality, I think it's even less useful, because I really have no idea what it's actually talking about, besides signaling a kind of period. It's a periodizing narrative, right? But I don't really understand what it means in any other way. And I think that's interesting. You point out the sort of difference in sort of temporal register between dematerialization and immateriality. And I wonder if that exactly has to do with what you marked as a kind of ontological discourse, within which terms like immateriality are proposed, defined, and implemented. And whereas with dematerialization, you have that was maybe originally popularized within an art historical or curatorial discourse, and art history, of course, is all about kind of like naming periods and kind of drawing boundaries around certain kind of temporal frameworks. So it's a kind of, the way you define something is you kind of track it over time and say, okay, this is what happened in this period, and this is what we're going to call this period. So it's a kind of very traditional teleological modernist history writing. It's a historiographical reflex, whereas immateriality sounds more like a category kind of generated through, it's a generation of a concept. It feels more than a label with conceptual pretensions, which I think is what dematerialization maybe is. But maybe that's a bit off topic.
I think that's spot on, though, and I think that if we sort of remember, I mean, I don't remember them, and I doubt neither do you, but all the conferences that happened in the early 2000s that were sort of trying to bridge the gap between, at the Tate and other sort of places that were trying to bridge dematerialization and immaterial labor as sort of concepts reflected against the art-labor split, which in fact is just sort of reinforcing these forms of different creative labor, which in fact is this obfuscatory program. When in fact early institutional critique of the kind that you and I have talked about in the last few weeks, in fact, did have a materialist dialectical approach to labor, if only in show a lot of the time. But if you don't mind, there's this one quote of yours, or an excerpt of yours from an essay that's really helpful for me in thinking about the historicization of institutional critique and its methods. If you don't mind, I'll read one more, where you write that institutional critique has aimed to clarify the legitimate bounds of critique. But in this case, the bounds have been drawn around the type of critique that artists could, in good faith, level at the institution of art, while also embodying it professionally, socially, psychically, and economically. This soldered artists and institutions together in an increasingly half-hearted tableau vivant of autonomy, a reconciled realpolitik not all that different from the kind that anointed liberal democracy as the least worst form of government still standing after everything else has ostensibly been tried. So for me, this statement has a clear continuity. I think this is from an essay in 2016 or 15, but it has a clear continuity with your book in that it's an invitation to consider forms of critique in art that are parallel to extra-parliamentary struggle, let's say, rather than liberal representation, forms that don't legitimize the object and subject of critique through reconciliation. And so unless I'm misreading the connection, this is a call for art that applies speculative negation, one that would in fact erode the classification of art as autonomous from productive labor. Is that right?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And I guess there I was also maybe trying to work on this other speculative category that kind of was using institutional critique as a point of departure. Maybe I think it's there that I first started working on this concept of infrastructural critique, maybe.
Yeah, it's that essay.
And I guess it was, what I was saying earlier about kind of the materially speculative, the kind of using the resources of the institution to go somewhere else. I think that's kind of what I wanted to think about with infrastructure, that it's not kind of always in this sort of psychoanalytic bad object relationship to the inescapable institution, as you have in kind of Andrea Fraser. And it's actually, I mean, this probably needs to be developed a lot more, because otherwise you run the risk of just seeing the art institution as a kind of neutral site that you can just use for whatever, which it obviously isn't. No site is neutral, neither art or anywhere else. But I guess, this kind of question of infrastructure means to sort of like try and sort of loosen this double bind that institutional critiques seem to have gotten bogged down in at a certain point. But I know we probably need to draw to a close, and I'm really interested in your next question and maybe the one after that. So maybe I'll stop blathering about the infrastructural critique for a second here.
Well, that term was really helpful for me, I will say, in thinking past the institutionality implied in institution, or let's say the static institutionality. But the next question is my favorite, whatever that means. And that is sort of to ask you about an argument you make in the book that art is a form of socially reproductive labor. And I guess this relates to our interest in Meryl Lederman Ukeles, who I'm actually embarrassed to even bring up, because I think every single podcast I've done at e-flux, I've brought her up because her work is just so helpful in thinking through a lot of these things.
I agree.
But the one work that I wanted to point to that you've written about is this "I Make Maintenance Art 1 Hour Every Day" work from 1976, in which I think it was the old Whitney had moved downtown to the skyscraper, and she basically went around the building and asked low-paid workers in the building to consider 1 hour of their work every day as art, as maintenance art. And so she would take a picture of them and ask if whether in the picture they are captured laboring or producing art, right? Making a mockery of this whole split. Or not a mockery, but definitely bringing up the sort of irrelevance of that split. But yeah, could you talk about how you make the case for art as a form of socially reproductive labor?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question, and also one which I feel maybe my conceptualization of or my work on could really go a lot further, potentially or hopefully, although it tends to fluctuate with the level of my interest in the category of social reproduction. I guess with Euclides, that practice is really compelling because it takes up both the gendering and in other works, like in the I Make Maintenance Art Every Day and other works, the gendering and the racialization of reproductive labor, and the relational constitution of this labor as maintenance, as routine, uncreative, and unskilled, versus the creation that belongs to the space of art making and display. So it's constantly in this sort of really amazing sort of tension and exchange between those. So that means it encapsulates the kind of two sides or the two reproductions I've chiefly been interested in. That is the feminist critique of art and the feminist critique of work, or to align more closely with my piece in Third Text a couple of years ago, the critique of labor from the standpoint of its gendering, and the critique of institutions of the reproduction of the social relations where that labor is situated. So the reproduction of capital or the reproduction of the capital relation. So that allows me to talk about both classical, feminist, critical, conceptual art such as Euclides, and contemporary critical conceptual art such as Cameron Rowland's, for example, as both types of institutional critique conducted from the standpoint not of the institution of art as their horizon, as their standpoint and their horizon, but how the institution of art plays a role in the social reproduction of the capital relation, or the socialization of the capital relation, which in capitalism means its naturalization. So here there's also maybe quite sort of canonical Althusserian notion of institution at work, like ideological state apparatus, that which stakes out a position of autonomy in order to do its work of naturalization more effectively. But that's more art as a form of social reproduction approached through an institutional lens. As a form of socially reproductive labor, that would maybe be more social practice, art engaged in community provision, which can be quite close to activism and organizing, and shouldn't necessarily be reduced to its contradictions or unmanageable pretensions, as in some projects, for example, Arte Utile or something. But I'm really very interested in thinking about the relation between Euclides' performance of maintenance art and her delegation of the performance of maintenance art in the two works that you mentioned. So you mentioned the I Make Maintenance Art 1 Hour Every Day from 1976, and her kind of earlier performance where she did that work herself at the Wadsworth Athenaeum about 7 years prior. So I see that work, which was accompanied by her Maintenance Art Manifesto, the earlier work, I see that as a critique of art as a reproductive institution performed through the modality of maintenance labor, which is gendered and domesticated in its coding by the artist's normative whiteness and femaleness, because I'm sure there were plenty of non-white staff doing those tasks in normal working hours for a low wage at the Athenaeum before she did it as her piece. And the second work, I Make Maintenance Art 1 Hour Every Day, being more like a critique of reproductive labor and the gendering and racialization that it entails, using art as a device. So that is, it could conceivably serve or have served an organizing purpose for those workers were it not recuperated as an authored work, or maybe even if it was recuperated as an authored work, it might have done. I don't really know enough about it or about its history or its context. But on that note, temporality, again, is also interesting because, of course, Ukelei's touch sanitation piece went on for a number of years and involved a much greater degree of involvement in the workers' tasks, lives, and sociality than this 1 hour a day piece, which might have been something I can imagine could have been something like a precursor to touch sanitation, which happened a few years later.
I think, I completely agree. I mean, the other sort of precursor that you mentioned is the mummy piece for this sort of bridging of a feminist critique of work and a feminist critique of racialized capitalism and its reproduction. In that she sort of, in that piece, nominalizes the same task 3 different ways, which is then valorized differently, right? So that the sanitation worker, the conservator, and the artist are all paid different wages to do the exact same thing, which is quite interesting. The other thing that's like really a bummer to think about, which you sort of, your point begins this conversation, is that when she started the residency at the Department of Sanitation, it was seen, and I mean, at least she told me so, that there was this organizing premise to it, that it was a way of sort of shining a light and bridging a gap. But just 2 years ago, the neoliberal austerity regime under de Blasio is actually using her name to invoke these new city residencies, which are just a way of art washing sort of their horrid austerity politics. So definitely this sort of the insinuation you make that were it not an authored work, there might be even more of a premise to not be recuperated is quite interesting. I wonder what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that it can be reduced to a work that can be recuperated because it's authored, because it's the processes that works like that can trigger are part of what makes them interesting as works, but also part of what exceeds them as being read solely through their work character, I guess you could say, with Adorno. But it's also true that they can only be recuperated insofar as they have the cultural valence that can be parsed in terms of a legacy with a name and a profile, and that's kind of impossible to avoid. It's like that question again of platforms, investment and disinvestment. It's like where do you, like, what level of acceptability do you have to gain in order to perform a critique that will have the kind of visibility that, for good or ill, you are pursuing.
Yeah, which then just produces these sort of very long-standing conversations about how much of my supposed autonomy should I relinquish so that I may actually be in a position to do X, Y, and Z, when in fact that sort of plays on that fraught duality between the two things, I think, or I would propose. I will say that you're doing a way better job of timekeeping than I am, already bringing up 2 questions ago that I'm keeping you too long. Would you mind if I proceeded to our last question?
Absolutely. That's absolutely fine. Sorry, I'm starting to do those stumbles that were mentioned as a possibility.
I think that's totally my bad. But I will say that you sent me just last night this great text. I hope it's okay that I mention it in anticipation of its publication, that you will have soon in Radical Philosophy, that has to do with the notion of bodies. And more specifically, the turn in a lot of different discourse, both theoretical and sort of in terms of praxis, let's say, to considering bodies as opposed to subjects or individuals and so on. And you write, I think I took a quote from it that was really helpful. Right, you sort of discuss the turn to bodies that underlines the prioritization of vulnerability. You write, or more generally, life, materiality, and affect, which constitutes the parameters of basic political analysis today. And that vulnerability, or more concretely, exposure and exclusion, which I'll say is very prominent to talk about today, you write, seems so much a facet of daily experience for so much of the global population that for many theorists, they suggest the parameters of any critical analysis that would prove adequate to both diagnosing the state and imagining forms of collective life otherwise. So yeah, I mean, I think the connections to today's conditions are almost obvious in the sense that after 3 months of pandemic, which has sort of led in part to this incredible uprising that has begun in the U.S., is one that brings the questions of vulnerability in terms of exposure to the fore. And so I wonder if you could talk about how you analyze this turn to bodies in your text and how you might situate it in the current conditions.
That's a really good question and a really good challenge. I suppose what is really important about the current moment is that it becomes really, really obvious as you've been observing how vulnerable bodies are produced by political economy and institutions. That this whole kind of idea of capitalism or kind of capitalist extraction and sort of like social chaos, breakdown of institutions, of the health system, of unemployment insurance systems, just everything as being kind of a pre-existing condition in the health insurance terminology. So just I feel like there's a much clearer and kind of recurrent and grounded analysis of just how vulnerability is produced and can be changed rather than being something ontological. My piece is really trying to deal with what I see as the kind of dangers of ontologizing vulnerability and not thinking about the social abstraction that produces it. So maybe just to be succinct, that's what I would say is you really not that vulnerability cannot be a political category, but the current situation, both the pandemic and the uprising, seem to me to be like incredibly positive in terms of a critique of that vulnerability as a practical critique of it and a theoretical critique as something which is very much an artifact of a particular mode of production of humanity as much as of kind of the economy. And so, I guess the kind of anxieties that I'm exploring in that text about vulnerability being a sort of ontologized, universalized kind of point of departure, and how bodies rather than subjects become a kind of central political category because we can only think about sort of alleviating a kind of constitutive vulnerability, as I'm thinking about in the kind of the work of Judith Butler, for example, on precarious assembly. I think what's going on now, at least for me, seems like it really makes that picture a lot more complex. And I think what's the kinds of articulations of critique, the kinds of slogans, the kinds of analysis that is coming out, at least in what I've been reading, really brings a kind of much more historical and sort of socially grounded approach to the production of exposure, exclusion, vulnerability, rather than ontologizing it, and in fact writes against its ontologizing and biologization, as with all the kind of unbelievably kind of like all these insane racist discourses that try and find genetic bases for why Black and brown people are more subjected to death by COVID-19 infection.
Yeah, I don't even want to give those idiotic things airtime.
No.
It might. I don't like when people say at the end of interviews, it seems like a great place to end because we could keep talking. But I will say, definitely. Ending with perhaps an allusion to impending legitimation crises of work, of capitalism as such, and of the state seems as optimistic a place for me to end as any. Yeah. Marina, thank you so much for being virtually where you are and in my headphones.
Thank you for these kind of amazingly like insightful and contextual and generative questions that really kind of pushed me to re-engage with with the book and also try and connect it to what I'm thinking about now, which, when you spend 55 hours a day processing information, can sometimes seem like a task beyond your capacity. So this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.